Once again, good morning to our audiences here with us in the room and the one who are joining us virtually from across the region. My name is Halil Karib. I am the Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, SIHA. I'd really like to thank you very much for joining us in these very important conversations. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge the support that through it we were able to organize and have these conversations from the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who supported our African and Global South Feminist Consortium, which is comprised of FIDA Uganda, Ethiopian women lawyers, and NAGAD Network of Somalia, and Musawa for Equality and Justice in Muslims family law. There is an increasing evidence and recognitions that discrimination within the family remain the biggest stumbling block to achieving equality and justice for women in the private and public spheres. Yet, family law reform today remains the most inflexible, the most complex area of law reform, because most of family laws are based on religion, they are based on culture, and they are based on traditions. And in our continents and in our region, Eastern and Horn of Africa, religious and cultural identities are vested in family laws, and as a result, at any attempts to reform these laws are often portrayed as threats to national and groups' identities and rights, and used as a justifications to resist the demands for reform towards equality and justice. The unjust power relation that dictates family laws and personal status laws, which is primarily reflected in the unjust power relations in society, have exposed women in the Eastern and Horn of Africa countries to surges of grievances and oppressions, and often violence, making women and girls hostage to the authority of male guardianships. That type of power dynamics, it legalized in many occasions violence against women, and it led to the impoverishment of women and girls by denying them access to resources and opportunities such as education and training. Family law is a political issue. Family law is a human rights agenda, and under the pretext of family laws and culture and traditions, and based on the interpretations of religion, women could have or have not have access to resources, lands, and any form of their human rights and entitlements. With this, I would like to hand over to our moderator, Ms. Elizabeth Komagisha of FIDA Uganda, to introduce to us these very interesting and important conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. There's an answer. So you Ugandan thing to just take the mic just to make sure. I don't see it anywhere but home. Good morning, everybody here, and then good morning, good evening, good afternoon for the online listeners from wherever you are. I would like to thank you very, very much for making it. I know the second week is usually very difficult to make it for side events, but we are grateful that you have managed to make it. I think what Hala has opened today is giving a really short background about what this conversation is going to be about. The theme of our side event today is Spotlight on Family Law, We Need Reform Now. And like Hala mentions, there's increasing evidence that discrimination within the family remains a big stumbling block to equality and equity of women in Africa. and that it's an issue of concern, and we cannot wait consortium where FIDA and CIHA and the Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association and other institutions from the whole of Africa are pushing for is one, a recognition that there is a problem, and then secondly, building synergies on how to organize and fight back some of these discriminatory policies and practices back home. I just put together in a minute just to share for you to just have a look at what's happening in some key African countries when we speak about family law and how it affects women. The laws in Burundi, DRC, and Mali still provide that a husband is the head of the household. We know that this is not true, not even just in those countries. We know back at home in Uganda, we know in Ethiopia, we know in Sudan that that's not true for many African families. But we also know that it has an impact on how women are treated because men are the heads of the households. We also see that in Cameroon, the husband has the sole administrative power over communal matrimonial property. And we know the issues of property rights in terms of ownership, access, and how it affects women's economic participation and justice in most of African countries. So this definitely has an impact on how women progress in terms of their economic participation and justice. In Algeria and Sudan, we still see male guardianship as the sole a practice in these countries. And we know that there are many other countries where this may continue to be a problem. In Algeria, in Mali, and Sudan, we still have laws on polygamy, they allow for polygamy, and we know the problem with polygamy in most of our African families, and we do hope that this conversation, and many that we'll continue to have even after CSW, continue to interrogate on how women are interfacing with these practices and policies in most of these countries. I'll close with the one from Kenya, where we see that the right to equality in marriage is limited in its application under Muslim law, and despite the constitutional guarantee of equality within marriages. So these are some of the key examples to just give us a picture on what's happening on the African continent and why we thought that this side event is important. And maybe also just to give you a sneak peek on what is happening in the We Cannot Wait movement, where we are organizing with grassroots women and CBOs and collectives to sort of find ways of fighting back some of these discriminatory practices and laws. On my panel, I have amazing women here today. We do have Ms. Lilian Biarugaba-Driko, who is the CEO of FIDA, and she will be speaking on the passing of the marriage bill and then the succession amendments and some of the reflections from the women's rights movement. We know that the law on marriage in Uganda has been on the shelves for over 60 years. I do not know how many parliaments have come and left it on the shelves. And in there are so many lessons that FIDA and the women's movement is learning on organizing, but also on interrogating what is so important in this law that it has taken these many years to get passed. What is it in there? And also what is at risk if we continue to operate like that? Ms. Hiba, you will allow me not to pronounce your second name, I may butcher it. But Ms. Hiba is a project officer from CIHA Sudan. They're also part of our consortium. And her presentation will be focusing on law, on guardianship, and its impact on women and girls in Sudan. And then Ms. Lensa, who is the director of EULA. EULA is the FIDA of Ethiopia. I like to say it like that. But the Association of Women Lawyers in Ethiopia, they're also partners. And she will be speaking on achievements in enacting good family laws, the challenges in practice of family law, and then the challenges of practicing family law after war. So we do understand that some of the consortium, most of the contexts of the members of the We Cannot Wait movement change because of either the cultures or traditions or the religion. And we know that those three play a critical role in how women interface with family law. I'll therefore just invite Lilian to set the pace for us, speaking on the struggle to have the marriage bill back, and maybe she'll also update you on where we are right now. How women are suffering because we continue to operate like that, but also what we risk to lose if we continue to not have this law. She'll also speak about the succession amendment and the struggles from the movement and some of the lessons that we have learned in there. Lilian.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Greetings, participants, both that are in the room and online. To the Strategic Initiative for the Whole of Africa, we thank you for convening such an important conversation. I work for FIDA Uganda, and we have been in the business of women's rights for the last 49 years. We are 49 years this year. Just to note that this is a collective effort of other like-minded organizations that we have been working on our advocacy journey. It is important before I start this discussion for us to note that Uganda has a legal plural system that has in turn informed a piecemeal advocacy process. For the longest time, Uganda's laws on marriage and succession have been statutes that came into force during the colonial era. The just amended succession bill, for example, was enacted in 1904. That is 100 plus years ago. I'll quickly give background to the legislative process that we have gone through as women's rights organization. The process for enactment of the new marriage law in Uganda started as far back as 1980 with a draft domestic relations bill. Elizabeth wasn't exaggerating. We've been on this journey for the last over 30 years. In 1995, the Uganda Law Reform Commission initiated a process to reflect the international obligations and the gender equality principles enshrined in the 1995 Constitution into the Domestic Relations Bill. That was in 1995. The first draft was presented to Parliament on the 9th December 2003. I want you to take note of the span in the years between the processes. The bill had provisions on, among others, conditions for polygamy, cohabitation, and its legal effect, marital rape, the return of marriage gifts upon dissolution of marriage, property rights, widow inheritance, and no-fault divorce, which were to apply to all forms of marriage. It was supposed to give effect to the principle in Article 31 of the Constitution on rights of the family, that states that men and women are entitled to equal rights during marriage and its dissolution. In 2005, just before the bill was passed, there was a protest of over 7,000 Muslim women on the streets. And this was compounded by a memorandum from the Grand Mufti to the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, then requesting that Muslims be excluded from application of the law as it violated the sanctity of marriage as envisioned in Islam. The bill failed to pass during a vote of members of Parliament. It was brought back to Parliament as the Marriage and Divorce Bill in 2009. That was 4 years later. And it was again rejected for seeking to recognize cohabitation as a family-forming union. The Marriage and Divorce Bill 2017 was also rejected, mostly by religious leaders, for having provisions on divorce. So in July 2022, that is again 5 years later, this is last year, Parliament was granted leave to a member of Parliament, Sarah Opendi, to introduce a private member's bill entitled the Marriage Bill 2022. We are hoping that we will have a success story to share, at least in 2023. But for now, that is where we are. After so many years of a lot of work, a lot of effort, we still have nothing to show for it. Just briefly speaking to the Succession Amendment Bill, this was presented to Parliament in November 2018 as a private member's bill. Government quickly presented the Succession Amendment Bill in 2019. So both bills were presented to the Legal and Parliamentary Affairs Committee, and this led to the passing of the Succession Amendment Act in April 2021. What is interesting to note is that after this bill was passed, the President refused to assent to it. And his justification was that there was no clear reason for a surviving spouse receiving 80% and dependent relatives receiving 20%, where an intestate is not survived by any lineal descendants. He stated that it would be unfair and would cause misunderstandings between the surviving spouse and the dependent relatives. The bill was brought back to Parliament and was passed and assented to by the President in 2022. I just want to note that in the bill that was passed, Section 14 of the Succession Amendment Act amends Section 27 of the Succession Amendment Act, Cap 162, to state that when a person dies intestate, the surviving spouse will get 20%. It put us back to where it is that we're trying to run away from. And of course, as Ugandans, this is in total contrast to Article 13 of the 1995 Constitution, which guarantees the right to equality in marriage and upon its dissolution. Section 14 undoes the gains from gender progressive court judgments, where the right of where the right of survivorship over matrimonial property was upheld for widows, basing on the right to equality at dissolution of marriage, as well as the recognition of death as a form of dissolution of marriage. I'll just quickly speak to the role of the judiciary in the legislative advocacy. When advocating for reform, it is important to consider how the push for change may be influenced by judge-made law or judicial precedents. These can contribute a great deal to the access or to the success or failure of the process of legislative advocacy by either reinforcing principles upon which such advocacy is premised or quashing them altogether. It is also important to consider the implications of the recent decision of the Court of Appeal case. This is in the Ambayo case for my Ugandan counterparts. I'm sure you saw what that did to our efforts on our advocacy journey. The judgment goes against the gender justice principles of equal distribution of property upon dissolution of marriage, which appears to also have been the judicial trend when making decisions on property distribution in divorce cases. The Marriage Bill 2022 that has just been presented, I see it as an opportunity for us to categorically legislate on how courts should distribute matrimonial property upon dissolution of marriage and quash the rather gender retrogressive principles enunciated by the Court of Appeal in that specific case. Very quickly on the key learnings, it is important to have a concerted effort as advocates for women's rights. It's interesting to note that some of the proponents of our advocacy effort were women who felt that the work that we were doing was a threat, or the recognition of cohabitation was a threat to their rights as married women, as well as those who felt that the bills were generally an attack on their faith. Male engagement is critical. I will not belabor that. It is also important to have a robust media campaign. There's been a lot of disinformation, misinformation on this journey, so it's important that we continuously engage them and educate them on what it is that we are trying to achieve. And we also need to pay keen attention to the role of the cultural leaders and the traditional systems that obstruct women's rights to inheritance, and the need for us to systematically and intentionally dismantle them if we are to make any progress on this journey. Maybe to also note that while tactical concessions can be made on certain bills, we must be careful not to lose the meaning of what it is that we are trying to achieve altogether, and for us to continuously pay keen attention on the new jurisprudence, both within the country and internationally, so that it can inform our arguments in the courts of law. Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Lillian. I think Lillian has given a very fair picture of how Uganda has been progressing over time, reducing this journey of 30 years plus to these 10 minutes to share on some of the interesting updates on how the Succession Amendment Bill and the Marriage Bill now is affecting women. One of the most interesting comments I've had about the Marriage Bill, initially when it was called the Marriage and Divorce Bill, was when we do include the word divorce in the name of that act, then a lot of religious fundamentalists kept on arguing that we are legislating an illegality, that divorce is an illegality. And we know that difficulty that you go through when you're going through the court process for you to be able to end a marriage right now in Uganda. And if a bill that important to marriage had to do away with the name simply because the religious fundamentalists were saying we cannot legislate divorce because it is not allowed in our religion. I wonder if everyone in Uganda is a Christian at the moment, but thank you so much, Lillian, for giving that perspective. But maybe also just to mention that one of the things Lillian has mentioned in terms of advocacy on these issues is how the judiciary has a role to play, but also are we able to check some of these judicial precedents that are being set. We saw in Ambayo's case that we undid a lot of progress, like Lillian mentions, in terms of progress made in terms of equality and equity in marriage. And it's interesting to see how much progress we had made initially and then how much work we have to do to go back. And that's why it's important that we are pushing for the marriage, so we have a statute that clearly guides on what happens, because we cannot look at laws of common law and what is it called? The judges, what is it called?
Discretion.
Yes, discretion, right? To practice discretion as they decide these laws, because that's what it was being said before, that let's have the judges decide case by case basis. So thank you very much, Lillian. I'd like to welcome Ms. Hiba Abubakar, yes, to speak on the focus on law, on guardianship, and how it affects women and girls in Sudan. You're welcome, Hiba.
Good morning, everyone. Before I'm going to illustrate how the concept of guardianship inside the Sudanese personal status law affects the life of women and girls and their safety and security, I would like to mention two important facts. That despite the remarkable contribution of Sudanese women to the political change that took place in 2019, and their role in overthrowing the 30 years of militant Islamist dictatorship under Bashir rule, Sudanese women continue to live under one of the most discriminatory family law in the world. It's also important to note that Sudan is one of 4 countries in the world that are not signatories to CEDAW, nor did the country ratify the African Protocol on the Rights of Women. The Sudanese personal status law is where the core discrimination against women is generated, which feeds into other Sudanese laws and policies that continue to be the law of land today. The fundamental concept of guardianship in Sudanese domestic laws is one of the greatest restrictions overall to Sudanese women's freedom, because it particularly limits women and girls' ability to control their life and make decisions independently. Sudan personal status law has still not been addressed by even the previous transitional government. For instance, under Article 33, guardians are defined as they are adult men that Muslim and of sound mind. They, among other things, decide upon the suitability of potential husbands, meaning that a woman can effectively be married without her consent if her guardian approves. On the Article 25th, 32nd, and through the 42nd of the Act, determine marriage responsibilities, and particularly Article 25th sets 3 essential requirements for the validity of a marriage contract. They are the inclusion of testimonies of 2 witnesses, payment of dowry, and the consent of a male guardian. Sudan's personal status law treats women as minor under perpetual male guardianship. This means that key decisions pertaining to education, employment, livelihood, travel, marriage, birth control, spacing of children are determined by male guardians rather than women themselves. This means such laws deny women full agency and autonomy, no matter that impact their life. Women and children are put in vulnerable socioeconomic situation by laws that fail to protect their rights. The effect of discriminatory personal status law and practices, as well as the court systems and procedures which limit women's access to justice, also contribute to poor mental health and other psychosocial impacts on women and children, effectively diminishing their quality of life. For example, child forced marriage is common practice in Sudan, as like 34% of women aged between 15 and 49 years were married before 18 years of age, and even 12% before 15 years of age 4. I would like to show like Noura's case, which is like a good example of how like the Sudanese person in status law affect the safety and security of women's life in Sudan. At the age of 15, Noura ran away from her town to save herself from being forced into arranged marriage to a man without her consent. After fleeing her home, Noura sought refuge at her aunt's place in Sennar State and continued her education until finished the secondary school. In early 2017, her family convinced her to come back, saying that the man was no longer interested in marrying her. When she returned to her family in Al-Bagir town, she found that the family was holding the wedding ceremony against her will and without her own approval. Her family at that time signed a marital contract. After the completion of the wedding ceremony, the husband took Noura to an apartment in Omdurman city of Greater Khartoum state, where he persistently demanded his marital right, between brackets, to have sex. Noura resisted any sexual relations with the man for 4 days, after which, when on day 5, he brought about 4 male relatives into the apartment. The men violently held Noura down to the bed while she was forcibly raped by the husband's relatives, and by her husband, and all the relatives witnessed this act of rape. The incidents took place in the late week of April 2017. Exposed to the traumatic effect of the gang rape, Noura defended herself against the husband when he approached her again the next day. Again, he demanded sex, upon which she told her assailant not to get closer to her while threatening him with a knife. He nevertheless approached her aggressively, disregarding her condition, and on his turn threatened her by saying, "We will see who died first." In this struggle that followed, she stabbed him twice, after which he regrettably died from his wounds. After that, Noura made her way back to her small town, where her father handed her over to the police and disowned her. Her trial, while Noura spent the last year in Omdurman women's prison awaiting her trial, the family's house has been burned down as an attack by the in-laws, the relative of the deceased husband. Noura's family fled, and Noura had not received any family support during her imprisonment. Thank you. I will hand it back.
Thank you so much. This has put me in such a somber mood that it's 2017 and women still have to go through this kind of discrimination. Yes, 2017, yeah, and violation of their abuses. I think what Hiba speaks very greatly about is the issues of really agency of women in the context of family, and you know. Okay, I will invite Ms. Lensa, who will speak about some of the achievements in enacting good family laws and the challenges that they have faced in practicing family law right after the war in Ethiopia.
Thank you so much. Good morning for here. I was listening to Hiba's story, so I was lost in between analyzing what it means when we talk about the reform of family laws in our context. So, and also I wanted to also thank you it put me to thank our senior women rights advocates who has been fighting for us to get relatively somehow a progressive family law in the country, because previously the Ethiopian family law has also had its own drawbacks, and it had lots of issues back in the days, but luckily it's revised 22 years ago now, so relatively we have a good progressive family law. So it puts me to thank most of the women's rights fighters back in the days who at least gave us this revised family law. Our organization, EULA, is one of actually the pioneer women's rights organization who've been fighting for many women rights and discriminatory laws in our country, which is also part of the reform of laws. Is one of the part that EULA has achieved is the family law reform, and also other law reforms in the criminal law, in the penal law, which directly related to the women's right issues. So over the years, as I try to mention it, the issue of family law has been a great deal, and most of the marriage issues, the consent issue, and also having that divorce, inheritance, everything that's included in the women's right in the family law issue has been challenging in the previous civil code that Ethiopia had. The struggle is, it's not that easy when we say we have a reformed family law, but during the struggle there are lots of challenges, challenging the deeply rooted patriarchy, and also most of the people in our country live in the rural areas, so the legal curiosity and asking the women who are in the rural areas, asking for their rights and understanding what's wrong with the family law context, which is also somehow challenging, and due to that it has become more challenging for women to defend their right and also their interest in pursuing the legal action in our country in family law cases. The success is, of course, after the enactment of the proclamation, the FIDA 1995 Constitution, which almost opens for most of the law reforms to happen, and also most of the institutions who are fighting for women's rights issues to be established. So post that one of the great achievements of the Constitution is it had an article and it had a provision which states about the human rights perspective in general, but also specifically in the Article 35, it specifically talks about the women's rights issue, which is a good loophole for women's rights organizations back in the days to leverage that act and continue and push for the amendment and for the revision of various laws. So under that it comes to this is how the family law revision came. So it has been revised as of 4th July 2000. And one of the things that I love about especially this family law, the family code, is how it incorporates the issues under its preambles, which clearly puts why do we need to reform the law. So why we need to reform the law is because I would love to read it as it is. It has become essential to make the existing Ethiopian family law in accordance with the socio-economic development of the society, and above all with the constitution of the country, and in particular realizing that marriage shall be based on the free consent of the spouses, and that it is necessary to provide the legal basis which guarantees the equality of spouses during the conclusion, duration, and also dissolution of the marriage, which is a very powerful term which almost incorporates most of the fights when it comes to the marriage bills that has been an issue for over long time in Ethiopia. It's also one of the other reason for the amendment of the revised family code, which is put under the preamble, is it found necessary to settle dispute arising in family by a competent organ in a just and efficient manner, which also opens the door for most of the family disputes to go back to the courts rather than to the customary practices that we are used to. Under the revision, it mostly provides and prohibited most of the discriminatory acts of marriage, including the bride abduction, and consent is there. Consent should be there by both parties when they go for marriage, and also the guidelines of unequitable division of inheritance, which is also a very critical point when it comes to family laws. And also it clearly puts the equality of women and men having that in the marriage, and also it puts child's best interest, which is, as we know, it's also one of the big issue is the issue of custody and the support after is also mostly it puts in it relies or it puts in the woman's shoulder usually. So this is also a good terminology. And aside from that, Ethiopia had different regional governments aside from the federal government. So each federal regional governments are also have the authority to enact their own regional family laws, which is also one of the good perspective, because they have to align that family law in accordance with the Ethiopian constitution law. The Ethiopian constitution, and most of our country's regional governments has adopted the religion. Their family law, except a few regions like Afar and Somali. How did we get there? Well, in order to have such kinds of a reformed policy, of course, EULA, Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association, has been lobbying, advocating, and practicing in participating in parliament's briefings back in the days. And aside from that, other also women's rights organizations who have been working in the women's rights issues back in the days were also the ones who are activating the process and voicing up the amendment of that law. And also we have had lots of campaigns and also promoting the increased legal literacy of the women in public and in their right is also one of the methodology that we have been using. And the media, it was a big issue back in the days when they start about the family law reform. Almost, most of the newsletters, the medias were talking about those women's rights advocates, and they have been talking about their personal life, even to the extent of challenging them personally when they talk about the amendment of the marriage and the divorce bill on that. But the other one good thing was Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association has free legal aid service that we provide. So when women came to receive that legal aid assistance, it also creates an opportunity to see the grievance, the depths of the challenge they face in families. So those court cases are also one of the modalities women use to advocate. Basically, it becomes on evidence-based advocacy back in the days. This is the challenge and the success. But what happened post-family reform? Well, as it is a deeply patriarchal society, we have to also see it from. Of course, we have a good law. Then what happened after? Are we practicing it properly? Does the legal practice really meets the expectation of the law? Is also another discussion. And it's still we still see some ignorances of some of the rights and safeguards guaranteed by the law. This can be both by the legal professionals and the law enforcement agencies, which actually makes it somehow difficult for the law to apply consistently and fairly. The limited legal infrastructure and access to justice, and high rates of poverty and lack of knowledge on gender equality, economic repentance, and hiding property when we get into the actual law litigation in the courts. The hiding property and hiding income and all those things are also part of some of the challenges women face during the in the enforcement of the law. There are still also regions who don't have a family law in our country. One of the points actually I want to stress and make a serious point on this. Of course, we have achieved a lot, but the traditional and the custom and the religion is one of the critical points, which is very serious still, especially on those areas who don't have enacted their own family law. Our constitution is also, as Leone earlier mentioned, we have also a pluralistic feature, and the Ethiopian society, specifically when it comes to the personal and the family issues, we have given customary and religious laws to be applied, which is still very serious issue. And the personal property, participation, family right, and marriage rights are compromised in those customary law and religious law. Some of even the practices and some of the practices that are there with that are incompatible even with our constitution, and especially on all the laws that we have signed and enacted as a universal human rights documents. It also have those women who came to seek for such laws are not also there, even if we got their consent, still it's the social exclusion and the loss of security to that is also one of the challenge of that regard. When we have to also see the women's rights issue, we have to start analyzing the legal pluralism that we have in the eyes and the perspectives of women's rights. So we have to, especially the principles of legal pluralism has the potential of eroding the constitutional guarantee of women. So we have to still see and monitor its implementation. Well, finally, I want to say on the key learnings that we have, of course, keeping the momentum. One of the things, when the constitution has been revised, the momentum that the women's rights organization has taken is, to leverage that opportunity to push for the amendment of various laws and practices. So that's also a good key learning that I can point out here. And also the advocacy works in the capacity building session should be very continuous, and it should push to the extent of until we achieve and until we include the regions and other parts of the country which are left without benefiting this law. And one of the points I put is leaving no one behind. And also monitoring political decisions through gender lens is also one of the critical points I want to mention. When we introduce the federalism structure and all, the one thing that we missed is when we open the legal pluralism space, we have to have a serious debate on how it's going to affect the right of women specifically, and monitoring our progress is also one of the key learnings I can put out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think what Lensa takes us to plenary by bringing up the subject of legal pluralism and how it affects women. We know that it has some advantages that it presents, but we also know that many times in many African countries where we have to choose between one side, women will usually get relegated to the side of a tradition, and we know what the problems are with some of the traditional norms and practices in some of the countries where we come from. One thing comes out very strongly: religion, culture, and tradition. I think, let me just check. Yes, culture, religion, and tradition are playing a key role in how women are existing in the family setting in many African countries. Of course, it's very different for Sudan and Ethiopia, where they've had conflicts in many parts of the country. Of course, that exacerbates the problem. But also what has come out very strongly from Lensa and Hiba is the infantilization of women in many of the family settings that women exist in, and the issue of urgency, but also on how the socio-economic situation of many women does not even allow for fighting back or for getting any support from family and communities for fighting back. There is also something that I've noticed in the three countries, the fact that marriage is treated as a domestic issue. And we know that many African governments, when something is relegated to the domestic, it's a private issue. I could say private in quote unquote, yet we know drawing a line between the private and public is a very dangerous place for us to go. Because many times you find that the women, the girls, are the ones that bear the brunt of that problem. It's also quite absurd that Sudan is one of the few countries, I think it's 44 out of the 53 countries, that have ratified the Maputo Protocol, one of the most expansive protocols on protection of the rights of women in all their diversities. So I know that it's a bad place when we don't even have some of those protocols that describe some of these things. But we also know that practice sometimes, like in Uganda where we do have laws on certain things, but the traditional practices at family level continue to play a key role on how women are treated in this space. I like that Lensa spoke about keeping the momentum, because I think it's very difficult, and if we're talking about the NGO and organizing back on some of these discriminatory laws, we know the arena in which we are operating in, the shrinking civic space. So sometimes it's a bit difficult to keep the momentum when we are organizing back. And that's why I think that We Cannot Wait consortium is looking at building a social movement. How do we do popular education? How do we build consciousness among communities to recognize that this is a problem, but also to fight back with us? So I'd like to use the next few minutes to get comments, to get any questions on what my three panelists have spoken about, but also you might have a comment on some of the key things that we might not have mentioned, because in 10 minutes it's really difficult to speak about everything. So I'll open the floor to get questions and comments. Let's try as much as possible to keep it in a minute or two so that we have a lot more to discuss at the end. Julia will be helping us with that.
Can we, before we take any questions, we just want to ask if anyone is uncomfortable being, like, if we also capture on the recording. If you don't want to be on the recording, just let us know. So everyone is fine?
Thank you for giving me this chance. I'm really happy to listen to all the panelists. What you shared with us is really amazing. And I learned a lot of things, and it helps me to understand the situation in Uganda, Ethiopia, in fact, which I know, and Sudan. Yeah, the story of Nora is heartbreaking, really. It makes me sad. And the situation in Uganda, my question for the Ugandan is, it's progressive. You worked hard to bring the issue to the government, but still you are facing difficulty with the fundamentalists, the religion fundamentalists. So how can you think to proceed in the future, is my question. In Ethiopian case, of course we have a very good law and the reform is made, but still we are struggling with the customary law and the practice. The legal is there, everything is there, it's fine, but still women and girls are affected with the situation, with the patriarchy existing customary law. So how can we proceed? All things is similar in Africa. Then our network, our struggle should be together. But we have to think, still there are lots of things to be done in the future. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation.
Elizabeth said that we have to first stop the microphone to check if it's working. Thank you. My name is Asha Mwanga, and I'm from Uganda. I work with the Islamic Women's Initiative for Justice, Law and Peace back home in Uganda. The ladies here have raised pertinent issues. If I had time, I would make a whole presentation on all the issues that you are raising, because they are very pertinent. But maybe I will make a specific comment on the Islamic family law and or personal status law. The remarks that came from Hiba, they are really, really heartbreaking. And whereas Noura's case is on the extreme, we have so many girls and women who are facing the same. The only challenge is that their stories do not come out in the media. Just 2-3 days ago, in Uganda, we have a woman, a Muslim woman, who ran away 2 days before her traditional marriage. She went into hiding. You cannot imagine that they had to look for her. They involved police. They found her after like 3 days and they arrested her. Such a person doesn't need arresting. Such a person needs rehabilitation because she's already traumatized because they're trying to force her into marriage. There are issues to do with personal status laws. But do you know why there are issues or challenges with personal status laws? Because those who legislate personal status laws do not do it from a patriarchal angle. They're not legislating what Islam says. Did you say she's Zura? Noura's father or parents and her husband knew what Islam says, they would have never forced her into marriage. Islam has a full chapter, chapter 4, Surah An-Nisa, talking about just women. Nobody talks about this. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that Muslims believe in, was completely a feminist. On many occasions, he spoke about women. And maybe I'll just leave you with this hadith. Actually, I'll leave you with two hadiths. One time, a man went to Prophet Muhammad and asked him that, who of all of us here is the best companion? He asked 3 times, and the Prophet has told him that it is your mother. Obviously, mother is a woman. It was only on the 4th time that he said, then your father. The same Prophet tasked men that, in form of a question, that can you beat your wife in the morning and then sleep with her, in this case have sex with her in the evening? Definitely you can't. But when they're speaking about, Islamic feminism, they don't bring out this because they're doing it from a patriarchal angle. And lastly, Elizabeth here raises the issue of legal pluralism. In Uganda, yes, we are grappling also with the same. We have, for example, the Mohammedan Act that under Section 5 encourages child marriages. Yes, it was outlawed like 2-3 days, no, a week ago. But the law that we are talking about is a 1906 law. We do not have anybody in this room, and maybe those ones online following, who was born in 1906. So meaning for all the years that it has existed, between 1906 and a week ago, the law has been condoning child marriages. Yet it is contrary to the Constitution, which talks about majority age of 18. So I understand where you're coming from, that there is a huge problem, and therefore we have, of course, to do quite a lot. But also preach, in this case, since I'm talking about Islamic feminism, preach what Islam says. If we were preaching what Islam says, whatever we are discussing, we wouldn't be grappling with it. Thank you so much.
You guys, please keep the questions short so that we can give a chance to many people.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Irene Konga. I work for FIDA Uganda. Mine is just a quick question. A lot of the struggles that we've had, of course, we've had with passing the laws has been the pushback on religious and patriarchal grounds and so on. But at the end of the day, the people that can get the laws passed are the parliamentarians. So my question is, how do we build a critical mass of parliamentarians who are aware, who understand the issues? Because a lot of the justifications, the dangers of a lot of these clauses, we know them as people within civil society and within the development world. But we need the parliamentarians in order to be able to pass these laws. And I think in Uganda specifically, we are like at an all-time low in terms of feminist leadership within the legislature, essentially. So how is it that we can create some believers, some converts within that house that can push this advocacy? Because I feel externally, as women's rights organizations, I think like sometimes when they hear us, it's like they hear blah, 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 because we are saying the same thing. How is it that we can get some people inside who can actually influence and can help to retain the integrity of these laws that we are trying to pass, so understand the why based in feminist ideology? I hope that was short.
I am Anthi from Sweden, and I have, thank you first of all for this amazing panel, and I have so appreciated listening to you. I have a special interest in Ethiopia, and I'd like to ask this question of having regional laws which allow for tradition and religion up to a point. There was a lot of information to absorb, so I don't know if you mentioned this as you were, but I gathered that you were fairly positive about how these laws being enacted locally. Or provincially, but I would have thought that it would rather, infringe on the constitutional law, which is a positive one.
Thank you. Just one more, and then I can bring it back.
Yeah, my name is Mary White Conte. I'm representing the Sierra Leonean Development Center. We're currently based in Ohio, and we are working in Sierra Leone as well. And I'm fortunate to be here with my board chair, Madam Baby Jibate. Yeah, thank you very much. We've had all the presentation. And as I say, the work of women in terms of giving it a feminist eye, it's a very, very crucial for us. Because taking a good look about, we want women to come into the front line in terms of taking leadership position and leadership position so that they can help to amplify our issues, the voice of women. But again, in our country, we are facing a lot of barriers because it has been laid down that it is a men's world and they don't want to see the women taking the leadership roles. There was a collective rape done by a woman. I don't want to mention her name because of the privacy. Up till now, since 2018, there is no justice for that woman. It was a gang rape in Sierra Leone, and the woman is languishing with pain, no current medical attention as I'm speaking up to date. So we are here as a civil society, how best we can put the issue of women in front to see what we can do. Because those in leadership role, like the government, the laws are here, but how are they implementing it? It is not easy. When you take the lead, you are being blessed to be another opposition as civil society. So we want to see how best we can come to the limelight and make sure we bring this thing to an end.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. You raised a very important question on what we are doing, or what work we are doing with the religious leaders to progress our advocacy efforts. One of the, I think the strategy is that we need to have a multifaceted approach as we deal with the different categories of duty bearers. So it's not just the religious leaders, even the parliamentarians themselves, what I is talking about. We have good representation in parliament, but they don't quite, either they don't have a voice or they are not speaking to the issues that we are continuously raising. So what we have done as like-minded organizations is to have strategic engagements. For example, we have an ongoing conversation with leaders or with Islam feminists like Asha in the room. And what we are doing is trying to craft messages that will help strengthen our advocacy efforts at all levels, demystifying Islam, bringing out the feminist approaches that Asha is mentioning. So it's multifaceted. We don't have a single approach, but we believe that if we engage in different cohorts, that we will make some level of progress along the way. But just to emphasize that it is not just the religious, it's also at the political level. And what I've learned this morning, or what we have also been trying to do, is to make these laws a priority within the legislative agenda. Clearly, family law is not a priority. There are very many laws that have come in place in the recent past that were passed in a year, that were passed in even months, but that's because there's a special interest in those specific laws. So the other thing that we need to do is to prioritize them, put them back on the agenda, and get the legislation to note, that they are as important, as Hala said, that it's a political issue, it is a human rights issue, and not just a family issue as they like to believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. I'll pass the mic to Eva.
Yeah, I would like to second what, your name, excuse me? Asha said, it's true, the Sudanese personal status law, or 1991 Sudanese personal status law, actually put by the Muslim Brotherhood regime, with radical Islamist group, and made by very conservative patriarchal interpretation of Sharia. And I totally agree with you. We need, Islamic feminism needs to make a counter narrative for such radical thoughts that may be translated to such backward laws. Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the feedbacks and also the comments. Yes, we have to work especially on the customary practices and the customary practices that exist in our country. One of the things I always wanted to stand from is from the perspective of the legal documents that we had. What did they say? And then how it should be treated is one of the arguments that we always put on. So the Constitution clearly, it's the FIDA Constitution, it's clearly puts that it's the supreme law of the land, right? So any acts or any practices that goes against that is illegal. So of course, for some family and personal matters, it recognizes the customary and religious law to be practical. But it does officially, the one that the religious law, which is the Sharia law, is the only one which is put in the Constitution or in the proclamation after that. But we don't have any customary law which is officially get an acceptance from our House of People Representatives or the HPR and any other organs. So the arguments should be also legalistic. And the other way, of course, women's rights organizations and other actors who are advocates of the women's issue should strictly work on how they increase the legal curiosity and the legal curiosity of the community, which we talk about. Most of the people who live in the rural areas, in the pastoralist areas, are still a victim of some of the leftovers that we put it in our laws. So we have to do lots of advocacy works on that as well. But always we stand with what we have as a women's rights organizations, as a women's rights advocates. What we stand is on what we have at hand. So that is something that we have to scale up and scale out. So even though even recently, there was a marriage which we have intervened and stopped, which has happened. One of our member who accidentally came across that marriage. She puts it in our attention, and now it becomes. We put the person who committed that act in prison by now. So we have to immediately act on any kinds of law. Practices that are going to happen in such scenarios. But aside from that, maybe one of the point I wanted to reflect as a last remark is whatever formal or informal justice this system that we had, we have to make sure that it gives protection and priority to the women's rights and to the women's in general. So anything that doesn't give or anything that doesn't acknowledge or anything that discriminates such acts, whether it could be a system, whether it could be it has a name like legal pluralism or anything, we have to fight back. Because our lens and our perspective is through what we see is through gender perspective. It's not about we see it from different or from other perspective. When we say this, we are not saying that those laws, those practices are completely wrong. We are saying specifically when it comes to the women's movement or the women's rights issues, they have a big problem in their implementation, in their application. So we keep challenging the status quo on that ground. So we don't have to shy about, or we don't have to just leave it there. We have to fight back on such kinds of laws. So always we have to make sure what is at hand, what do we have at hand that we're going to make sure the rights of women and girls are respected in our specific countries and also in our specific continent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lensa. I know we have about less than 5 minutes to close, and I'd like us to close on an action note. And I'd like to use Irene's question really to guide us really to just hear from maybe two people from the audience on how are you in your country building that critical mass amongst parliamentarians, because regardless of how much investment that you're putting into making proposals for changing these laws, I know the issue of cohabitation, for example, in Uganda, in our marriage bill has been supported by so many women's rights activists, so many feminist groups and other collectives. But we continue to hit a stumbling block because certain members of parliament will say this thing you are trying to do ABC and it will not work, right? Or they will say the religious groups say we cannot legislate this because it's against the Christian religion, even when Uganda is a secular country. So just to hear from perhaps two people, how do we have change makers? I do not like to call them champions, change makers among us, the legislators. How do we do that? I know that, for example, FIDA and EULA has done trainings, feminist trainings for some members of parliament, but we know that they keep changing. But also we have few changes, like what you get out of there is usually about 5% from the investment that you're making. With our meager resources, how do we build that critical mass amongst legislators to be able to say this thing, even when I do not believe in it, I'm sure I'm legislating for beyond myself, beyond my family, beyond my religion, and especially having equity at the back of our minds. Maybe Julia, two people, because we have 3 minutes now left.
I'm reliably informed that we're in good time, so maybe 3 people.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you to all the panelists. Unfortunately, I don't have the solution, but I'm going to try to make some proposals. Thank you for all your contributions and for all your work. We really appreciate that we have people working on these important issues. So I wanted to pick up a point that you made, Lillian, in your presentation about the role of misinformation. I think that we have underestimated the organizing and the work being done by anti-rights groups on the issues of family law and also on issues of sexual orientation and gender identity and all these other things, because usually it's more or less the same groups that push narratives about like what family values means, about what family justice means, about what even a family is. And so I think that we need to really think about that misinformation piece and think about how we can create more positive messaging about what families look like so that we can have laws that respond to that, instead of having this exaggerated and where religious leaders and cultural leaders and certain parliamentarians take up so much space in our media space, and that's what informs the public's view. Many people's views are informed by the media that they consume. So I think that we need to make more of an effort in terms of pushing more, realistic narratives about what our families look like, so that you can have laws that correspond to that. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dunia Makonitagin. I am from Empower Girls Now. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. For the question raised by Elizabeth, I want to suggest that I think the issue is that we don't have it in institutions. Whenever legislators, change, and when we have like new parliamentarians in any country, then that viewpoint actually is not going to be structured, or it's not going to be embedded in the institutions, not only in parliaments, but also in other institutions. And I think the first thing that we should do is institutionalize what we are working on, gender issues, work with the institutions, and make it like an institutional value to work on gender-related matters. And the second thing I see is to work with the religious institutions themselves. Especially with regard to, personal status laws, family laws, and other laws, it's important that we actually, work with the leaders themselves, because there is, as you know, there are several negative perceptions about the issues, and we don't have common agendas. My organization, for instance, works on female genital mutilation and cutting, and there is no agreement between religious leaders. So how do we kind of work with the religious leaders so they can kind of consider it as a common agenda? And I think it's important that we work with religious leaders and that we institutionalize our work on gender. So it doesn't actually, change and when we have different, parliamentarians and legislators every year. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. I'm Dr. John. I would be remiss if I don't make my comments based on the issue. I have served with government here in New York City as the point person for women, as well as for immigrants. And a lot of what you have given to us today, we have seen it here in New York City. One of the things that we had to work on was the whole issue of female genitalia mutilation, because it was very big here in New York City. We had to work with a lot of other issues dealing with women coming from African countries. How did we do it? But we had great level of success. And I heard the person here just mention about, coming together in a coalition encompassing all of the entities that can give a voice on the issue. That means having to partner with faith-based institutions, our legislations, our lobbyists, our schools, and everybody getting them involved. As a government person, what I could not do as a representative of government, I had my community partners doing what I could not do. And on my level, I know what I could have done as a government representative. But we need that partnership that shares the common goal and identify the right strategy. And a lot of times, we don't take time to look at what have we learned over the years? What is there in different countries that we, even though we're here in the United States, that we need to understand if we are to impact and to change legislature?
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much. Bezawit from Ethiopia as well. So I just want to make a few comments. One to kind of respond to Elizabeth's question about building that critical mass of change makers. And one of the things that we can share as an experience is the transformative leadership for gender equality that we have. These trainings for lower and middle level women leaders, but also for candidates as they run for elections. And these maybe tailored trainings at regional levels as well in the local languages. So having that level of women who, the curriculum, the transformative leadership curriculum also includes really points about gender equality and the issues, the family laws, the laws that we're talking about, so that as these women go into higher positions of leadership, as they win elections and go into parliaments, they can take those issues and advocate for them. So that, and then just one more point about sustained engagement, because in the end, I think it's perseverance that can actually take us to that point, to reach that point where we want. So that sustained engagement with religious leaders, with traditional leaders, with women organizations and women at the grassroots level is really critical. So thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentations. My name is Antonia, and I'm with Equality Now, which is an international human rights organization. And I know we've partnered through our Africa office on this issue, and it is truly a global issue. And so we have started a coalition, the Global Campaign for Equality and Family Law, and I hope we'll be able to amplify each other's work and advocacy. And I'm based here in the United States, and just to pick up on what my colleague said about New York, Even here until 2 years ago, we didn't have a minimum age of marriage of 18 without exception. So there's many issues around the world, and we don't have constitutional equality either. So that's just one example, but thank you for your work, and I really look forward to our working together in the future and making this a truly global UN level priority to get all governments to live up to the obligations for equality under family law. Thank you so much.
Oh, excuse me, I don't have a fluent English. I'm francophone. Okay. Okay. Let me thank everyone and the presenter of this session, which is for me a very good now for women, because family problem is a very a real problem with women growth and employment and I don't know, they're improving themselves. I understand for the few minutes I passed here, I'm sorry I was late, that how to make laws with parliament, and now we need action. For my country, excuse me, I'm from Togo, West Africa. I'm here for International Alliance of Women, and my cabinet, CDCOM, which work for Women Council and Development. In our country, we try to do something with law, with parliament, and we make all the, we go around the country. And because for, what do you call it, polygamy or monogamy system, we talk about religious. In Togo, we have Muslim, Christian, and animists. But for, we ask a question to women. How do you say? Curiously, women say they want polygamy. But when we make our propositions is to push the lawyers, the parliament to vote monogamy. But people, women in the country, in the small village, in the small cities, says no, they want to be polygamy. And the parliament, that's why we say now our problem is very, very difficult, but we need necessary, honestly, reforms to improve women knowledge and everything. I come for another session which begin after this one. I was in Doha last week for last development countries, and we propose an action program, or what do you say? Let me voilà, montrer what we propose in our cabinet for women is to work like termites, and we propose this prototype like a termite month all around the world, where, as we are here in my city in Togo, we have this house built like this, connected with this session, and let our young girls and women see directly what is happening in New York now. Then it won't be like, oh, it is an intellectual organization, or women, free women be together and talk about women who don't like some change. But we need change since in our small cities. What of this proposition? If we have women houses connected everywhere, and they are seeing the experience of those people, they can make something, they can make their own self-opinion and join the movement of equality.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all. You see, I think we are already seeing the importance of collective thinking, that we are getting some of the responses and some of the actions to improve some of the work that is already being done, to fast track some of the things that are stagnant, but also to strengthen the coalition that is doing this work. I'm glad to share that there's already a coalition, and I think most of the recommendations that have been shared are going to play a very good role in ensuring that we are responding to some of these issues. I took note of us really recognizing the power of dis and misinformation in our communities that was raised first. And then there was an issue of institutionalizing some of these gender studies. How do we link gender studies and law with our parliament? How do we build systems so beyond persons, because MPs change all the time. So how do we build systems? And here for me, I was thinking about the scorecard. Back in Uganda, the local government, there is a scorecard that is used by civil society organizations to rate how a particular local government has performed in terms of female participation at the local government level. So is that something that we want to propose through the gender committees in our different countries, that we do have a scorecard to actually check how well particular parliament has performed in terms of responding to some of these discriminatory laws. There was something about inclusion of faith-based institutions in our coalitions. I know that this is an issue of discussion when we return back home on how do we include many other players outside civil society to influence, because the resistance is coming from these groups. So how do we find the positive thinking members of these other institutions to include in our coalitions to be able to push back together? And here, just personally thinking, do we build a cohort of MPs in the particular coalitions or movements, social movements in our countries, to say we do have 10 out of these many hundreds of MPs that we are able to count on to counter some of these arguments? Because you see, sometimes an issue is very contentious and everybody is seated, and there are about 3 common faces in parliament that we'll discuss. I think we saw this for the counterparts from Uganda during the discussion of the sexual offences bill. The usual common faces were making comments, even when some of the most important parts of the bill were getting thrown out. So do we build a cohort of MPs that we are able to know when this issue comes up, we support them, develop opposition papers, opinions to present during plenary to fight back some of these discriminatory policies and practices that are discussed. I'm excited to hear about what Equality Now plans to do to link with some of our the work that we're already doing on family law. So I think after this we'll be able to link and see how we can think together, how do we push together. I like the example from the lady from Togo and it's very interesting to usually actually hear these things when we are saying this particular practice is very dangerous for women, but there are very many women in communities that are comfortable with this kind of practice. We'll take an example of FGM, that there are certain people that actually run away through the borders of, for example, Uganda to Kenya, or from Kenya to Uganda because they want to get cut, right? And yet we are here fighting. FGM is bad. This cutting should be legislated against. Let's speak to communities. So it's, I think, really important. I think here for me, I see social movements as some of the ways through which we are able to respond. Popular education, how do we build consciousness to let people know? Because not everybody is aware. If I've grown up being beaten as a partner, then I do not know any better. And that's what my children will also be able to experience. So I like the reflections that you gave us on how do we link with grassroots women, grassroots really quote unquote, how are we building consensus and synergies with women in their communities who have lived like this all their lives, to say this is not how actually you're supposed to be living. This is discriminatory, this is not acceptable. So I think here there's a lot of work to do from many recommendations that you've shared, and I'd like to appreciate you very, very much for sharing those. And my panelists, I know we still have a few minutes, as informed we had a few minutes. I don't know if we have one more person to share, then I'll pass the mic on, but that will be in a minute or two. Do we have something burning, something we cannot leave out? Since Asha, you had spoken before, there's someone at the back that came in after to speak, and then I'll call Hala to close us off.
I'll try summarize, but lawyers retend to want to speak a lot. Very, very sorry for having come in late, but I'm happy to catch some of the dialogue. I just wanted to highlight two comments maybe to spark a bit more thought in and out of session. So the first is around how we keep investing within women legislators. Given it's a long-term investment in terms of lobbying, advocacy, and building capacities, but also there is the probability it goes left or right. But I just wanted to emphasize that there is, I think there is value. There is great value in consistently investing in women politicians and women leaders within our different contexts. Mostly because a political career will traverse time, whether active in government or other institutions. So there is value in that. We've seen that even with CSW67. I'll talk about my home country, Kenya. We've seen politicians in current government and in other semi-autonomous government entities also participate with the negotiations and things like that. So in the long term and within the broad spectrum of the political landscape, I do believe there is value. It costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of time, but there is value in investing in building capacities of our women politicians and legislators across the spectrum. But the second that I wanted to ask was around family values within jurisprudential aspects. Coming from a common law jurisdiction, we've been able to see anti-rights and anti-gender groups leverage on jurisprudence that then becomes law around family values and family justice. So how can we also, within the movement, the feminist movement in Africa, and especially within the legal sphere, think through long-term legal interventions that also give us that kind of anchorage in terms of developing jurisprudence that is pro-women, that is pro-feminism, that is pro-human rights, broad-based.
Well, I'd like to say thank you very much for such a productive conversation. We can keep talking for the coming months about family law. I'd like to thank the fantastic panelists. Thank you, Elizabeth, for moderating such an important conversations. And we just have to remember that there is no equality for women without equality within the family. And I think it's very, very important not to underestimate or undermine the struggle for equal family law and family relation. Family law intersects with women's peace and security, it intersects with women's human rights, it affects every aspect of our rights, and the resistance is going to be massive. And unless we claim our positions, within the policy and the politics sphere, within the religious sphere, within all the power
spaces and spaces that, controlled by patriarchy, we will always continue to be pushed back under the pretext of religion, under the pretext of culture, and that's the danger of family law. Thank you very much, and I hope we see you again in another CSW, and we really appreciate your contribution and input. Thanks a lot.